All right, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and call to order the regular meeting of the City of Murfreesboro Board of Zoning Appeals for September 28, 2011. The first item on the agenda is we're actually going to switch item 2 and 3 around. We're going to take item number 3 first. The election of chair and vice chair. As you all know, those terms run concurrently with the term of the member who holds that position, and both Davis and myself, our terms they're expired, in June maybe?
At the end of June.
At the end of June, and we were reappointed to the board, but we need to also elect new chair and vice chair, so I think we should probably need to take those separately, and so we'll consider election of a chair first. Do I have a motion for that?
I'll nominate the current chair, John Rogers, to continue to serve in that capacity.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Are there any further nominations or discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, I won't ask if there's any opposed.
How could there be?
All right, and then we'll move on to vice chair. Take a motion for vice chair.
I'll make a motion we re-elect Davis Young as the vice chair.
I'll second.
Motion and a second. Any further nominations or discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we have a new chair and vice chair, or old chair and vice chair, I guess. And now we will, some older than others. All right, we'll now move on to consideration of minutes for the regular meeting on August 24, 2011. Those minutes were included with our agenda materials. Are there any changes to those minutes? If not, then those minutes will stand approved as presented. And we will keep moving into new business. Begin here with variance requests. We have application Z11046 by Mr. Steve James of James & Associates Residential Designers for Dr. and Mrs. Robert Bray, making the following requests for property located at 521 East Main Street in a residential single-family RS-10 zone. First variance request is a 1% variance to the maximum allowed 25% lot coverage. Second request is a 15% variance to the requirement that accessory structures or uses in residential districts shall not occupy more than 25% of the required rear yard. And finally, a 2-foot variance of the minimum required 5-foot side setback for an existing accessory structure. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. And good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and members of the Board of Zoning Appeals. Our first item today, as you mentioned, is at 521 East Main Street. The property is located along the north side of East Main Street, in between Highland Avenue and University. Subject property is also located, in addition to being in the RS-10 zoning district, is also located in the historic zoning overlay district as well. And any approval here would then approval here would then be subject to approval by the Historic Zoning Commission for any new development on the property. The applicant is looking to tear down an existing carport that's on the property and rebuild a new garage. The existing carport is in the northeast corner of the property, and if we could pull up the aerial photo, you can see it there. And it is actually, according to the applicant, is right on the eastern property line, so it does not meet the minimum 5-foot side setback for accessory structures in the RS-10 zoning district. The structure in question, the existing structure, is a little over 700 square feet, and the new structure that the applicants would like to construct in its place is roughly 1,000 square feet. there are a few variances two variances that they need in order to be able to rebuild that new structure in the place of the existing structure. In the RS10 zoning district, there is a maximum 25% lot coverage. And you'll notice in the application materials, Mr. James, who is representing the property owners, has submitted calculations based on the existing lot coverage and the proposed lot coverage. You'll notice that the existing lot coverage is at 23.8%, and that includes the existing garage, a greenhouse, a chicken pen, a rabbit hutch, and the footprint of the existing house. So right now they are under their maximum lot coverage by about 1.2%. They're looking to increase the lot coverage by 1.8%, which would put them 0.6% over the 25% maximum lot coverage, because the structure that they propose is larger than the structure that's there already. So they have requested a 0.6% variance to the 25% maximum lot coverage. I've rounded that up to 1% and advertised it as a 1% variance in order to, if you grant it, give them a little bit of flexibility in the building process. As we know, things aren't always built as they're shown on plans, and this will allow a little bit of flexibility in the building process. The applicant points to a few things in his request for justification of this variance, primarily that the footprint of the existing structure is the existing structure which was built according to the assessor's office in 1900. The footprint is rather large and does not allow very much room for accessory structures in addition to the footprint of the existing structure. The zoning ordinance also states that accessory structures cannot occupy more than 25% of the required rear yard, also known as the required rear setback. In this case, the lot is 72 feet wide, which multiplying 72 by the 25-foot required rear setback gives 1,800 square feet. So no more than 450 square feet of that 1,800 square foot required rear yard can be occupied by accessory structures. Adding the rabbit hutch and the greenhouse, along with the existing accessory structure, they're already exceeding that maximum 25% coverage of the required rear yard. They're at roughly 31.7% right now. Replacing the existing carport with the proposed garage increases this number to 39.7%, and we've rounded their 14.7% variance to 15%, also to give them a little bit of flexibility. The applicant points to the fact that this lot is narrower than a lot of the other lots in the historic zoning district. At 72 feet wide, as opposed to a lot that was much wider, which would be the case of a lot of this, a parcel of this size. As you'll notice on the aerial photo, you'll see that there is the outline of the lot in question as compared to the lot directly to the west and the lots directly to the east, which are wider. So the narrowness of the lot, multiplying that by the required rear setback, doesn't give the applicant much room to work with in that required rear yard, and they're trying to keep that new garage in roughly the same location as the existing carport. One of the things that will be improved as a part of this new accessory structure is the fact that the existing carport is built right on that side property line. As I mentioned, the applicant does not propose to encroach into that 5-foot side setback along the eastern property line. So the new structure is proposed to be compliant with the setback requirements. Now here's the plot plan that the applicant has submitted. So here is the footprint of the proposed structure, meeting both the 5-foot side and 5-foot rear setback. And you'll see here is the greenhouse, which is also located in the required rear yard, as is the small rabbit hutch. Previously, there was a chicken pen that was built along the rear property line that was actually in violation of the setback requirements. When the applicants were notified that that chicken pen was in violation of the setback requirements, they promptly demolished it to come into compliance with both the zoning and codes requirements. They have relocated their chicken pen to here, and they actually are using a chain link pen, and they're going to put wire along the top of it in order to keep predatory animals out. But the location that it has been moved is actually not compliant with the minimum 5-foot side setback requirement. And so that's the reason for the third variance request, is that it's roughly 3.3 feet off of the side property line, the new location of the chicken pen. And we've advertised a 2-foot variance because Mr. James is estimating that distance off the property line. He has not had a surveyor certify that distance. So we're given, in the advertisement, I've given them a few extra inches in case you approve the application and in case Mr. James's measurements are off by an inch or two. They've decided to request that side setback so that it can remain in its current location. And the application materials state that this will allow them to avoid disturbing or relocating existing in-ground brick sidewalks and raised garden areas surrounded with large timbers to support said garden areas. Here is a rendering that Mr. James has completed of the proposed garage. So it'll be a 2-car garage, and there will be a hobby and exercise room on the second floor of the proposed garage. Now I'll show you some photographs of the site. This is the front of the house from East Main Street. This is looking back down the driveway at the existing carport that is proposed to be demolished. As you can tell, it is pretty much flush with that east side property line. There's a little bit closer view of that existing structure. This is the property next door to the west. And this is the property next door to the east. This is the proposed chicken pen. This roofing was temporary. As I mentioned, they're proposing to put wire along the top of it to keep animals out. But Mr. James, and this is the fence that runs along the west side of the property, Mr. James estimates that it is approximately 3.3 feet off of that side property line. If the board approves the lot coverage and rear yard coverage requests, staff recommends the following conditions. The design of the garage will be subject to the review and approval of the Murfreesboro Historic Zoning Commission. Number 2, a surveyor will be required to help lay out the footing of the new garage building, and a surveyor's certification must be provided that the building meets all setback requirements and is compliant with the actions of the board with respect to lot coverage and coverage of the required rear yard. If the board approves the side setback variance for the chicken pen, staff recommends the following condition. Verification from a surveyor must be provided that the chicken pen is no closer than 3 feet to the west side property line, and this must be provided at the same time as the other surveyor certifications listed above. Mr. James is in attendance to answer any questions that you have before or after the public hearing, and Dr. Bray is present as well if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? Matthew, in the staff notes, it talks about since the property is on RS10, there's a minimum required 25-foot rear setback. I'm sure you said it, but I missed it. Why are we talking about a 5-foot rear setback and not a 25-foot rear setback?
Because it's a detached accessory structure that's greater than 5 feet from the principal structure. Are you talking about the new garage?
Yeah. See, the zoning ordinance states that accessory structures cannot occupy more than 25% of the required rear yard. In this case, since the property is zoned RS10, there's a minimum required 25-foot rear setback.
And that's the general rear setback for the RS10 zoning district. And
Okay.
what the zoning ordinance states is that in residential districts, accessory structures, even though they're not subject to those setbacks, cannot take up more than 25% of that required rear setback.
I'm sorry, so you're saying the accessory structure has a rear setback of 5 feet?
That's correct.
Okay. The 25-foot applies to the house?
Yes.
Okay. And it would also obviously apply to the greenhouse and the rabbit hutch?
Yes. All of those accessory structures would only be subject to 5-foot side and rear setback requirements as long as they were detached from the house and separated by greater than 5 feet.
Okay, I'm with you. All right, any other questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you. Mr. James, Dr. Bray, anything y'all would like to add to your application?
Well, Steve James, representing Dr. Bray in this matter. The only thing I'd like to add is, again, the size of the lot. It's very narrow. There's a lot of accessory structures in this yard, and because the narrowness of this lot, it makes it a little difficult to get everything that's in there. And also the chicken coop that's on the side where it's at approximately 3 feet now. After going through a Board of Appeals yesterday, that is the proper code distance. The 5 was adopted by the city of Murfreesboro. So if we were under international code, that wouldn't meet the code. Okay.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. James? All right, thank you. At this time, we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion. We have 3 components to this application, which we probably need to take separately. So I guess we'll first consider the request for a 1% variance to the maximum allowed 25% lot coverage.
Chairman Rogers, if there's no discussion, I make a motion we approve the 1% variance subject to staff comments.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Not all.
Hang on, sorry. This is a variance just for all structures, including the main structure.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
All right. No further discussion. Then all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. We'll move on to the request for a 15% variance to the requirement that accessory structures or uses in residential districts shall not occupy more than 25% of the required rear yard.
Chairman, I'll make a motion we approve the 15% variance subject to the staff comments.
I'll second.
All right. I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Not all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. And finally, we'll consider the 2-foot variance request of the minimum required 5-foot side setback for an existing accessory structure.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the 2-foot variance, subject to the staff's comments.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Dr. Brown, I'm personally just going to vote against that component of the application. As far as livestock, I think it's fair that we keep that within the setbacks that are allowed. I don't know if I think it's a slippery slope going into setbacks, particularly for livestock, when it appears to be fairly easily movable. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Okay. Dr. Bray, Mr. James, that application has been approved in its entirety. All right, we'll move on now to application Z11051 by Mr. and Mrs. Kent and Cecil Coleman, requesting a 13-foot variance of the minimum required 40-foot front setback in a residential single-family RS-15 zone, and this is for property located at 933 East Main Street. Regarding the same property, the applicant is also requesting a variance to the requirement that detached accessory structures on corner lots in residential zoning districts shall be located no closer to the front lot line than 10 feet behind the front of the principal structure on the same lot. All right, Mr. Blum, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The subject property is located at 933 East Main Street, which is on the northwest corner of East Main Street and Cherry Lane. The applicant is looking also to tear down an existing carport and rebuild it. However, he does not want to rebuild it in the same location where it is right now. And what I'll do, I have misplaced my aerial photograph. Let's see where I put that. Here we go. Okay, here's the applicant's house. And you can see here in the back corner there's an existing carport. The applicant's driveway currently comes off of Cherry Lane and runs all the way along the rear of his house to the existing carport. What the applicant would like to do is to tear down that existing carport, move the carport closer to Cherry Lane, and be able to reclaim some of his backyard as actual backyard instead of driveway. The existing house is over 100 feet from East Main Street, so it's pushed back closer towards the rear property line than it is to the front property line. And as it is right now, as I mentioned, the majority of his backyard is actually driveway. And you'll see here on the proposed site plan, there is his house. As I mentioned, it's over 100 feet from East Main Street. There's the existing carport, which he plans to demolish, and as he would, the majority of the driveway that is there running from Cherry Lane. Here's the location of the proposed carport, which, as I mentioned, would be closer to Cherry Lane than the existing carport. It would actually be closer to Cherry Lane than the side of the house that faces Cherry Lane. And we consider the side of the house that faces a public right-of-way to also be the front of the structure as well. And detached accessory structures cannot be located closer to the street than the principal structure. And as a matter of fact, they can't be located closer to the street than 10 feet behind the side of that principal structure. So if we could put that back up, you'll notice that there is the edge of the house, and so there is a portion of the carport that sticks out further towards Cherry Lane than the existing principal structure. So Mr. Coleman has made two variance requests. You'll notice that the proposed carport is 27.3 feet from the front property line along Cherry Lane. And as we know, single-family lots that are corner lots have two front lot lines and two side lot lines, and two corresponding front setbacks and two corresponding side setbacks. So because this would be encroaching into the 40-foot front setback along Cherry Lane, he has made a request for a variance into the, of 12.7 feet into that 40-foot setback. And we have advertised it as a 13-foot variance, once again, to give a little bit of flexibility. And he's also made a variance to the requirement that the structure cannot be located any closer to the front lot line than 10 feet behind the front of the structure, 10 feet behind the front of the principal structure. You'll also notice that he is still maintaining that driveway off of Cherry Lane. It would be shorter, however, and there would be a little bump out there, and of course this would be an open carport. He is also proposing a circular driveway in front of his house along East Main Street. So this would not be the only driveway that he would have. He would also have a larger circular driveway at the front of his house. This is a very preliminary rendering of the carport, and it's subject to change. This is looking at it from East Main Street. The proposed carport is 23 by 24, and then in addition to that 23 by 24 carport, there's a storage room attached onto the north side of the carport. There's an existing brick wall that runs along Cherry Lane directly in front of the location of the proposed carport. As I mentioned, the existing house is about 100 feet off of East Main Street, and it was built in 1949 according to the Rutherford County Property Assessor's website. The existing driveway leading to the carport comes in from Cherry Lane and essentially travels the entire length of the rear yard. In building the new carport closer to Cherry Lane, the applicants wish to reclaim much of the area now taken up with driveway as green space. The location of the existing house does not leave a very large area for a backyard, and the applicants are hopeful that moving the new carport closer to Cherry Lane will allow them to convert what is now driveway into a more functional backyard. In addition, the applicants state that the area around the existing carport does not drain very well. They state that they are also shortening the driveway to decrease the impervious surface in the backyard in order to allow for more absorption of rainwater into the ground. You'll notice there are two sets of photographs that have been included with your materials. One set are from the applicant. This is an area around the carport where he's had drainage problems that he's hoping to, by reducing the amount of impervious surface, assist in remedying those drainage problems. One thing that you'll recall, last month we had a variance request on Cherry Lane where the utilities came in from the rear of the house. In this case, the utilities also come in from the rear of the house. The applicant is actually looking to run those utilities underground if he can get permission to do so from the utilities. But this is the existing carport, and those lines actually run right on top of the existing carport. You can see that one of the lines is actually literally right on top of the existing carport. But if the carports move forward, that conflict will no longer be the case. This is the existing brick wall along Cherry Lane. This is a view of that brick wall looking out from the driveway where the carport would be located. This is looking from Cherry. These are the photographs that I have included in your packages. This is looking from Cherry Lane into the site at the existing carport to the rear of the house. This is the front of the house. This is the property directly across Cherry Lane. This is a view of that existing carport. It's looking out towards the road, down the driveway from the existing carport. And this is the house directly to the north of the subject property. That would be on Cherry Lane, just to the north of the property in question. If the board approves the variance request, staff recommends the following conditions. A surveyor must help lay out the footing of the structure, and a surveyor's certification must be provided that the structure is compliant with the actions of the board as well as all other setback requirements. Number 2, the design of the carport will be subject to the review and approval of the Murfreesboro Historic Zoning Commission. I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing, and Mr. and Mrs. Coleman are both in attendance if you have any questions for them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you, sir. Mr. and Ms. Coleman, anything y'all would like to add to the application?
I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
All right. Any questions for Mr. Coleman? Going to let you off easy. Thank you. All right, at this time, we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussion or a motion. Again, we have 2 components to this application. So we'll take the request for the 13-foot variance of the minimum required 40-foot front setback first.
Mr. Chairman, I move for approval of the 13-foot variance, subject to staff comments.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, now we'll consider the request for the variance to the requirement that detached accessory structures on corner lots be located no closer than 10 feet behind the principal structure.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion we approve the variance, the 10 feet, subject to staff comments.
No, I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. and Ms. Coleman, that application has been granted in its entirety. Thank you. All right, next we'll consider application Z11052 by Mr. Barry Arnett, making the following requests for property located at 271 Freedom Court. And this is in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. First, a 13.1-foot variance of the minimum required 40-foot front setback. Second, a 33.1-foot variance of the minimum required 60-foot front setback for detached accessory structures. And finally, a variance to the requirement that detached accessory structures on interior lots in residential zoning districts shall be located no closer to the front lot line than 10 feet behind the front of the principal structure. Mr. Blum, if you'd review that for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. As you mentioned, the subject property is located at 271 Freedom Court, which is located in the Haynes Haven subdivision, just to the west of Memorial Boulevard and just to the west of Adams Place. Bring up the aerial photograph. I lost my cursor. There we go. Or my arrow. There's the applicant's property. You'll notice it is right in the curve of Freedom Court. The applicant would like to construct a detached garage on the subject property, and he has made several variance requests in order to be able to do so. The lot is what we would consider, even though it's the front property line is curved, it essentially has 3 property lines, a front, 2 sides, and so it's essentially a triangular lot. So the way that we look at a triangular lot is we consider this whole lot line that abuts Freedom Court to be a front property line. Both of these would be side property lines abutting the neighbors to the west and to the south. And the way that we figure out the rear property line is we take a point in the back, and I won't go over the specifics of that, but then we come up with the rear lot line, which is kind of at an angle from this lot line to this lot line, and that becomes the rear lot line. So essentially, a point or a line that's a certain distance off of this back point. It's. Am I losing anybody yet?
If you could do the calculus on that, I know they taught you that at school. We'd be glad to see it.
It's actually in our zoning ordinance. The point there's a line that we draw when these two property lines are 10 feet apart. That becomes the rear property line, and we measure the 30-foot rear setback from that rear property line. So essentially what Mr. Arnett has is what we would consider a triangular lot. Mr. Arnett came into the planning department several months ago and consulted with me about where he could and could not put a proposed detached garage. And essentially because of the shape of the lot and the regulations that govern the placement of detached accessory structures, there was really a very limited ability to place a detached accessory structure on the lot. Mr. Arnett's first iteration, and this is the current one that's before you today, Mr. Arnett's first iteration showed a larger structure that actually protruded out a little bit closer towards Freedom Court. After we received that plan, we reviewed it for traffic sight distance from this driveway to the south, and discussed with Mr. Arnett and his engineer that in order to avoid a traffic sight distance conflict with the driveway to the south so that they would be able to back out, that structure would have to be moved further in. So Mr. Arnett came back with a revised plan and moved the proposed garage closer to the house and actually shortened it. I believe it was a 24 by 30 to begin with, and he made the garage that's before you today is a 24 by 24 garage. The proposed garage would be a front entry garage facing Freedom Court. There's an existing two-car garage here and an existing one-car garage here. There would not be enough separation in between the proposed structure and the existing one-car garage or there would likely not be enough room for a car to back out of that one-car garage. And I'll show you photographs in a moment that will kind of depict what I'm talking about. But Mr. Arnett says that one-car garage he basically uses as a shop anyway, so he does not plan on using that for vehicular storage and vehicular parking. As I mentioned, one of the issues that we raised was traffic sight distance from the driveway to the south. And you can see here Mr. Arnett's engineer has submitted a traffic sight distance plan showing that the proposed garage, while very close to the traffic sight distance area that he would be required to stay out of, actually the garage, as it has been redesigned, actually stays out of that traffic sight distance area. And we also looked at the driveway on the house to the west, and the garage will be out of the traffic sight distance area for the driveway for the house to the west on the other side of his property as well. Mr. Arnett submitted an exhibit and this was based on the old size of the garage and the old location. This is an exhibit of where it would be. He's got it outlined in blue in relation to the property to the south. Now, as Chairman Rogers mentioned, the proposed location of the garage requires 3 variances in order to be located as such. First, it requires a variance from the 40-foot setback in the RS-15 zoning district. The property is zoned RS-15. All structures must adhere to the minimum 40-foot setback requirement in the RS-15 zoning district unless they have a variance. The applicant will be encroaching into that roughly, or not roughly, but exactly 13.1 feet. So he is making a variance of a variance request of 13.1 feet. Second, detached accessory structures that are greater than 5 feet from the principal structure must also meet a 60-foot front setback requirement, which is actually greater than that 40-foot front setback requirement in the RS-15 zoning district. So he is requesting a 33.1-foot variance of the minimum required 60-foot front setback for detached accessory structures.
Hey, Matthew, can you say that again? So the house and anything else would be subject to 40-foot detached accessory structures are subject to a 60-foot setback?
That's correct.
So this thing's not just in the detached accessory setback, it's in the house setback?
That's correct.
Okay, I'm with you.
Yes. And you can see here, if we can pull up the, I put the wrong one up. And you can see here is the 40-foot setback, and it cuts through the front portion of the proposed garage. And the garage, in order to be outside of that traffic sight distance triangle, is proposed to be located at 26.9 feet off of that front property line along Freedom Court. It can't be located any closer than 10 feet to the south side property line because there's a 10-foot public utility easement along that south side property line. So he's right at about 10.5 feet, I think, at the proposed location from that south side property line. So in addition to the 40-foot setback requirement in the RS-15 zoning district, because it's a detached accessory structure, it would have to be 60 feet off of that front property line as well. So it would have to be 60 feet off of this entire front property line. At no point could it be any closer than 60 feet to that front property line. And then in addition to that, detached accessory structures cannot be located any closer than 10 feet behind the front of the principal structure. And as you can tell, this protrudes further out towards Freedom Court than the existing principal structure. So the applicant would need a variance to that requirement as well. Because of the shape of the lot, there are severe limitations, as I mentioned, as to where an accessory structure could be placed or constructed. In his justification for the variances, the applicant points to the triangular shape of the lot. He says that the shape of the lot leaves him with a large side yard and very little backyard as compared to traditional rectangular single-family residential lots. In addition, he says that the curve of the street and, as a result, the front property line make it very difficult to comply with respect to the 40-foot and 60-foot front setback requirements. He also mentions that looking north, it will not protrude any closer towards Freedom Court than the existing garage on the house to the south. Now I'll show you some photographs. This is the front of the applicant's house. This is the side yard here that he proposes to locate the garage. It would be in this area here. It would be to the left of his existing driveway.
Matthew, that garage on the property to the south, that's attached?
Yes, sir. This is the side of the applicant's existing house. You see he's got a two-car garage here and then a one-car garage here. He mentions that he only uses the one-car garage for a shop and for possibly storage of a motorcycle. The proposed accessory structure would be located here, directly across from that existing one-car garage.
There's no new driveway that's going to use that same driveway to enter this structure?
The driveway is proposed to be expanded. And to answer that question, let me put the site plan back up. See, it'll be a front entry garage, so he'll be expanding the driveway out, flaring out. It'll be the same width at the street, but it'll flare out so that he can access that the garage doors.
It'll be front facing
Yes.
the road.
Yes. Now, he has mentioned in his write-up that he does intend to brick the facade in order to match the existing facade the facade of his existing house. The board may wish to discuss whether that would be an appropriate condition. Now, just some photographs of some properties in the area. This is the house across the street. This is across the street and a little bit further to the south. This is the applicant's side yard right here. And this is looking from the driveway to the south. This is where we wanted to make sure there was clear traffic sight distance for someone backing out of this driveway. This is the applicant's property here. And this is looking up from the side street directly to the south of the subject property. Here's the house that's to the south of the subject property. And Mr. Dodd, there's the attached garage that you referenced earlier.
It looked freestanding from that other way. It looked like it might have been detached.
It kind of juts out
Right.
a good bit from the main plane of the home. And this is just another view of the side of the house where the structure is proposed to be located. If the board approves these requests, staff recommends the following conditions, or condition rather, singular. In order for the proposed building to stay out of the traffic sight distance triangle, the building must be constructed in the exact location shown on the site plan. To this end, a surveyor will be required to help lay out the footing of the building, and a surveyor's certification must be provided that the building is in compliance with the actions of the BZA and is constructed in the exact location shown on the site plan. And because there's really no room to play with there to stay out of the traffic sight distance triangle, we've advertised the variances exactly as they're shown on the site plan because it can't go out any closer to the road in order to stay out of that traffic sight distance triangle. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Mr. Arnett is here if you have any questions for him as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, I don't know why this struck me, but to the west, there's a property there that you showed a photograph of that's got a structure that looks like a detached garage as well. Have we considered anything on this street similar to this application before?
Was that on the aerial photograph?
No, it's this photograph here.
Is it this one? Oh. That structure right there, we have not, to my knowledge, we have not considered any variance requests on that structure. If I had to guess, it's probably compliant with the 60-foot setback, and it definitely looks like it's 10 feet further behind the front of the house.
Just look close to that property line. It looked different, so. It looked like apartment up there or something, so I just want to know if we voted on something right across the street before. Or...
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, I have one. From time to time, we have a maximum amount of a variance that can be approved. I'm assuming we wouldn't be considering this if it was over the maximum. Just curious, is there a maximum with respects to the minimum required 60-foot front setback?
There is not a maximum.
Okay.
I think what you may be thinking of is with our sign variance requests. I think our sign ordinance has a maximum built-in variance, 15%, Mr. Ives? Is it? In part of it, yes. In parts of our sign ordinance, there's a maximum built-in. But technically, if the applicant wanted to request an entire waiver of a side setback requirement, they would have the ability to do so.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Arnett, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
Thank you. I'd just like to say within a square block there are 4 detached garages. Now, they are on perfectly rectangular lots. And the only reason I'm having to do all this is because I do not have a rectangular lot and I can't meet the standard zoning. And I just want what my neighbors have. Thank you, sir. Anything else?
Any questions for Mr. Arnett? All right, thank you, sir. At this time, we're going to conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward, state your name, your address, and any comments that you might have.
Good evening. My name is Scott Heatherly. I live across the street from Mr. Arnett's house at 266 Freedom Court. Can I bring up the site plan on here?
Sure.
So we can...
You said your name is Heatherly?
Yes, sir.
Use the mouse right there.
Okay, thank you. For those of you not familiar with Haynes Haven subdivision, I've personally been at this residence since it was built 3 years ago. And one thing that I'd like to point out to the council is that it is a very extremely populated with activity on the street, specifically on Freedom Court. There are a lot of side roads that folks will make their laps around, whether it be older couples or younger kids riding bikes. And also with, I've seen a lot of folks cutting the corners or cutting the corner right there, as you saw in the picture of that of the road, Freedom Court, in front of both our homes. So in looking at the plan here, it is correct that the edge of the building would not interfere with someone backing out of this driveway. But my main concern with the addition of this additional building is the fact that it does protrude out beyond the ordinances. But more importantly, when you look at a car that would be parked in front of this garage right here, and let's just say it's an 18 or 20 foot vehicle, you're looking at really at that point making it a blind corner. And I'm extremely concerned about the safety of the individuals within the subdivision that use our road as an exercise path, if you will. Not that that's very safe, but it happens, all the time, all day long, morning, noon, and night. So, more concerned about the safety of the individuals than I am upsetting a neighbor. Hopefully, I don't. But that I just wanted to bring that up to the council before it was voted on. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heatherly. Any questions for Mr. Heatherly?
Mr. Heatherly, you said you lived across the street.
Yes, sir.
Did we see your house in any of these photographs, or?
If you don't mind me.
And that's directly from front door to front door? Is that on the top of the curve there?
This right here, where you're looking at, would basically, if I were standing in the center of my home there, looking out to the road, I would be looking probably in between the two-car garage that he is asking to be built. So it's just a little bit to the north of that of his home.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, anyone else wishing to speak for or against the application?
Chairman Rogers, members of the BZA, appreciate you listening to us. My name is Lyle Lynch. I live at 295 Freedom Court. I am 2 houses and 2 empty lots down from the applicant on the same side of the street. I hate to be a whiny neighbor, but you're the BZA, so y'all get to listen to us. I'm going to make a couple quick points, and they really apply to all 3 requested variances, and then I'll get out of the way. I'd like to show some photographs on... okay. These are 4 residences from the applicant to the block ending in Duncan Court. In the upper right-hand corner is my house, and I am very pro detached garages. They are wonderful things, and I think everyone should have one. My point today is that the reference to lot is not conducive to a detached garage. These are 4 detached garages just on the block, and the one that Mr. Dodd brought up that's kind of across the street is in the upper left-hand corner. And yes, there's a detached garage with what appears to be an apartment above that at that residence, and again, that's directly across the street. I am, as I mentioned, 4 lots down, and the other 2 are across the street and a little bit farther down from me. The point of all these pictures that were taken Sunday is twofold. One is that all of these other detached accessory structures meet the requirements of being 60 feet away from the street. All of them meet the requirements of being 40 feet away from the street. And thirdly, they are all actually behind the rear of the house. And this contrasts with the current applicant reviewing today. Secondly, the issue was brought up about a vehicle being parked in front of the garage, since the door of the garage would face the street. And that brings us back to the original plan. Again, this is closer to the setback line than the front of the house. All the others are behind the rear of the house. You can see an apron that would be between the road and the door of the garage. And back to my picture here, the comment was this was taken last Sunday. These photographs were taken last Sunday, and each one of these has something parked in front of it. You would think with 4 and 5 garages we would be parking all of our vehicles in the garage, and it doesn't seem to function that way, at least on Sunday afternoons. Lastly, here is an aerial view of the street. The applicant's lot is located at this location. Right at the tip of my pen is where the detached garage across the street is located that I mentioned. Other detached garages are located here, here, and then mine's located here. I think I covered up with my hand the locations. But an aerial view of this, once again, just reiterates that the subject lot is simply not conducive to an accessory structure. That's it in a nutshell. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Mr. Lynch. Any questions for Mr. Lynch? Thank you, sir. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against the application?
My name is Ben Barrett. I live at 299 Kevin Drive. I also own the 2 vacant lots directly across the street from it, and I plan to live at those locations someday in time, maybe if the housing market comes back up. I guess my main concern is my wife and kids and I, we do walk around that block there, and there is a lot of foot traffic and bicycle traffic. And the right there is the starting of the curve, and past that is a S curve. And kids like to fly through there very fast. And I don't want to mistell it, but I think we've had 2 or 3 accidents where people have hit brick mailboxes coming around there. One motorcycle hit a mailbox, well, just right, well, you can't see what I'm pointing at. But anyway, my concern is there's not really any obstructions blocking the view through there now, and yet we have still had 2 or 3 accidents right through that S curve from people flying through there too fast. And I'm curious to know if this would obstruct the view somewhat. I think the simplest thing to do, I mean, I'm not the, how do you turn this thing on? Is it on now?
It's on. There you go.
Okay. Let's see, which way do I need to turn that like that? The simplest thing to do, I believe, if it were my house, Barry?
Sir, you can use this right here. And then you can speak in the microphone.
Okay. Let's see, I'm not sure if I can see it. I would take the garage that you're wanting to build and set it right up in this corner here of your house and simply add it onto the house and make your garage a double stacked, 2 cars deep, and you might not need any variances at all. It would be something to think about. But anyway, that's about all I have to add to it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Questions for Mr. Barrett? All right. Thank you, sir. Anyone else wishing to speak for or against the application? All right. Seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussion or motion. Again, we've got 3 components to this application, and we'll consider those components separately.
Chairman Rogers, I did want to add that I received this email this morning, and the person wanted to get this on the record. It's from a Miss Joanne Nolan Batson at 410 Freedom Court, and I told her that I would pass along her concerns to the board.
All right, her comments are she lives at 410 Freedom Court. She has seen the layout plans for the zoning request on Freedom Court. She does not feel that the addition will be good for the overall look of the neighborhood. The house is on an odd side lot, and adding anything else to it will only make it worse, in her opinion. Also, I'm afraid that the house being located on the S-curve will only add to the hazards that already exist there.
I was going to mention the 250-foot sight triangle. Is that a requirement? Is that a guideline? Does that just happen to be what this sight line came out to? Safety seems to be one of the concerns.
The distance is based on the speed limit, and in residential zoning districts, the speed limit, if not otherwise posted, is 30 miles an hour. And so therefore we require 250-foot clear, so that 250 feet was based upon the speed limit in the neighborhood. And so we looked at it both from we just looked at the structure. We didn't look at any vehicles that might be in front of the structure. We looked at it from the driveway to the south and the driveway to the west. And the structure itself, if placed as shown on the plans, would be located outside of the traffic sight distance triangle that's in our zoning ordinance.
And you mentioned he amended the proposed structure to make sure that 250 feet was intact.
That's correct. Initially, the structure was a little bit closer to the road and was 24 by 30 and side facing. It was originally proposed to face the doors of his existing garage on his house, and then he revised it to make it front-facing and to square it off at 24 by 24, and he pushed it further in as well.
Well, the issue of vehicles being there is a pretty good issue. I mean, I'm inclined to go with the city on the sight vision aspects as far as safety goes. But I think one of the things that hadn't been addressed is, other than ingress and egress to the front part of the garage, if he leaves a vehicle there or a trailer or anything else, now you've got an obstruction issue again. Because that sight line goes right to the corner of that building and takes up most of the flange out of the driveway. So I don't know if there's a way to put a restriction on
Where stuff's located?
keeping parking things in that particular area, or if that would even give enough, who polices that, and anything that's parked there would be transient, so it would be one of these things where if there was an issue, it'd be hard to.
I'll say I'm concerned, Mr. Arnett, about this one. It just seems like we're trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. I just don't think, I kind of agree aesthetically it's not going to look very good, but candidly that's not one of the considerations that we use. We don't go by aesthetics when talking about variances. We look at, are there practical difficulties, the narrowness, the shallowness with the lot itself? Are there physical features that are unusual when compared to the property in the same zoning district? The practical difficulties weren't created by you. I'd say you've probably proven all that. What we get down to, though, is the last one, and that is the variance will not endanger the public health, safety, comfort, morals, or welfare of the city residents. And I kind of share Mr. Dodd's concerns about the safety aspect of this construction. I do think it poses, it can and might well pose a hazard to people coming around that street. Yes, we're going to finish our discussion, and then we'll let you have one more.
If the existing driveway stayed the same and the entrance to the garage was somehow in the middle part of the, forming, I guess, more or less a courtyard there, but that flange driveway, vehicles being in and out of there, it's going to cut right into that sight line, seems to me.
All right. Mr. Arnett, if you want to make one more comment?
I don't have the pictures with me, but if there is one picture that shows my vehicles parked. Now, right in front of the single garage that I'm going to use as a shop, I've got a half bath and even heat in there. There is parking there. The two-car garage, I've got ample parking there. I needed a functioning garage that I could park my vehicles in, that I could pull in and out of. I am a single person. I live by myself. And I have no reason, and I can go with anything you want to prevent me from parking vehicles in front of that garage door. But I just want what my neighbors have. I mean, I agree that I am in that curve, and I can't do anything about that. I've worked with Matthew. We've redrawn it 4 times to try to get it where we thought was acceptable. And I met every one of his requirements. But I can't explain the parking, but I can park different than that. It's not going to be no primary parking in front of that garage. I need it as a functioning garage, somewhere to put my vehicles. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And let me address that comment, Mr. Arnett. I understand where you're coming from. We also have to consider this is something that's going to exist for the next who knows how long. You may not live there that long. And so somebody may come in behind you and operate differently than you do. They're not party to this conversation that we had today, so they may well be parking vehicles in that driveway. So we kind of got to look at it from a long-term aspect, beyond just what you say and what you do, what people that might buy your house later might do. I kind of consider that. All right. Any further discussion? We ready for a motion, and we'll consider the first one, I suppose, the 13.1-foot variance of the minimum required 40-foot front setback in the RS-15 zone.
Mr. Chairman, based on my statements and the concerns that have been expressed here, based on the movable nature of vehicles in and out, and like you said, the fact that we don't know how future occupants might operate and whether they're going to know about restrictions of vehicles being parked there, I feel compelled to move that we deny the 13.1-foot variance.
I guess in exhausting all the deed restrictions we put on accessory structures, like not being used as an apartment, I guess that option's not. I mean, again, that's something we hadn't done before, but that's the. I mean, I was okay with the structure itself, but I agree with the concerns with vehicles there, but I guess that option's not there.
Well, I think as far as a condition to be placed on the approval of no vehicles parking in front of it, I think that one would be a difficult one to enforce.
Yeah, I agree.
Mr. Ives could opine on whether or not that would be an appropriate condition, but as far as the enforceability, that might be difficult for staff to make sure that no cars would park in front of that garage.
Yeah, I believe that would be virtually impossible to enforce. And in concept, it would be an appropriate condition, but as a practical matter, I don't see how that could be effective.
Okay.
I'll second the motion.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All right, if not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that component of the application is denied. Is it required then that we continue to deal with the other two components? I mean, if one's denied, it kind of by necessity requires that.
I haven't particularly analyzed this, but it appears to me, Matthew, that all three of these would have to be, although they are three separate ones, they would all three have to be granted in order for this structure to be placed where it's proposed to be placed. So, as a practical matter, I think that this does deny the application. Would you agree, Matthew?
Yeah. In order for it to be placed in the proposed location, all three variances would have to be granted.
Renders the other two moot, I would suppose.
Yeah. I believe the other two are moot if the first one is denied.
Okay. All right, Mr. Arnett, then your application has been denied today. All right, we'll move now to height variance request, application Z11053 by Mr. Derek Wheeler for Integra Hills, LLC, requesting a 2.5-foot variance of the 35-foot maximum permitted building height in a residential multifamily RM16 zone. And this is for property located along the south side of Manson Pike, west of Fortress Boulevard. And this is in order to allow the construction of a 37.5-foot tall structure. structures. Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The subject property, as you mentioned, is along the south side of Manson Pike, west of Fortress Boulevard. The applicant proposes to build a new apartment complex called Integra Creek Apartments. We bring up the aerial photo. The property is here, just to the east of Puckett Creek. And it's actually a long piece of property that runs from basically the dead end of Manson Crossing Drive all the way up to Manson Pike. You can see when this photograph was taken back in the spring of 2010, the construction had just gotten underway with the realignment of Fortress Boulevard and Manson Pike. As I mentioned, the subject property is here and basically stretches from Manson Pike all the way south to this stub street here. There's an existing apartment complex. I believe those are all two-story apartments located at the intersection of Fortress Boulevard and Puckett Creek Crossing. Back here is the Puckett Station single-family subdivision. The subject property was recently rezoned to RM16, and as I mentioned, the applicant is seeking to build an apartment complex. You have the site plan in front of you. You'll notice that the arrows are pointing to all of the buildings that are where the applicant has requested a 2.5-foot height variance. You'll recall that back in 2008 there was an apartment complex on Cason Lane that was making essentially the exact same request. That apartment complex was never built, but the applicant is essentially asking for the variance for the exact same reasons. In the RM16 zoning district, there's a 35-foot maximum permitted building height. The applicant would like to build an three-story apartment complex with 9-foot ceilings. And according to the applicant and from some other apartment developers that we've heard from, 9-foot ceilings are an amenity in apartment complexes that are desirable, and so much so that our Planning Commission is actually going to be considering amendments to our zoning ordinance to increase the height, the maximum permitted building height in the RM16 zoning district to allow for these buildings with 9-foot ceilings, because under the current zoning regulations with a 35-foot maximum permitted building height, the 9-foot ceilings are really not achievable. And so the applicant is requesting a 2.5-foot variance. The buildings would be 37.5 feet tall, as we define height, which, as you can see on the attached elevations, we measure height to the midway point between the eave and the ridge of the roof. So at that midway point, these structures will be 37.5 feet tall. Now, the architectural rendering or the architectural elevations that you have in front of you are merely to depict the height. These are by no means the final architectural elevations. The applicant has been before the Planning Commission for initial design review, and the Planning Commission saw no issue with the increased height and no issue with the applicant moving forward to the Board of Zoning Appeals. And so the applicant still has to go to the Planning Commission for final design review and site plan review. But while staff is bringing to the Planning Commission ordinance amendments that would, render this type of request unnecessary, the applicant's time frame is such that he wants to move forward before that ordinance amendment would go into effect. So instead of waiting to see whether or not the ordinance amendment goes through, and we're actually going to be holding a public hearing on that at our next Planning Commission meeting, the applicant decided to go ahead and apply for a height variance so that he could go ahead and move forward with the permitting process and begin to construct this development as soon as possible. Not all of the structures are going to need a height variance. As you'll note, there are some structures that they're calling carriage units that I believe will be 2-story units, and those structures will not need height variances. They'll just be the buildings that are denoted on the site plan in front of you, which will be the 3-story buildings. The applicant has mentioned in his justification for the variance that this is an amenity that is desirable, that the Planning Commission is moving forward with amendments to where he would not need to make a variance request in the future. And the Planning Commission was fully supportive of that amendment in its initial discussions. And the applicant has also indicated that the shape of the lot dictates that in order to get the desired density that he build up, and he's actually still under the maximum number of allowed units by about 40 or 50, even with the 3-story buildings. This is looking at the subject property from Manson Pike. You can see it's part of a larger undeveloped tract. And this is looking down Manson Pike to the east. The property that's a part of the same tract on the corner of Manson and Fortress is zoned commercial highway. And this is Manson Crossing Drive, which stubs into the subject property, and the southern end of the complex will be right here. And this is that apartment complex just to the southeast of the subject property. And this is Manson Crossing Drive, which is that street that I just showed you that stubs into the subject property. If the board wishes to approve this height variance request, staff recommends that any approval be subject to the following condition. The Planning Commission must grant final design review and site plan approval for the proposed development. Mr. Wheeler is present if you have any questions for him before or after the public hearing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, Mr. Wheeler, anything you'd like to add to the application?
Good afternoon, Derek Wheeler with Integra Land Company. I would just like to make a note that I may have inadvertently typed in Integra Hills LLC. It's actually Integra Creek LLC for the record, and we'd appreciate your support on this height variance. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. Any questions for Mr. Wheeler? All right, at this time we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
No further questions. Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the application subject to the staff's conditions.
I'll second.
All right, have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Wheeler, that application has been granted. We will now consider application Z 11054 by Mr. Greg Tucker for the Rutherford County Historical Society. He is requesting a special use permit in order to operate an institutional group assembly use, which would be a club, and a philanthropic institution in a residential duplex zone. This is for property located at 717 and 721 North Academy Street. Regarding the same property, the applicant is also requesting a variance to the requirement that in residential districts, an institutional group assembly use shall have a lot size of not less than 3 times the minimum lot size permitted in the zoning district where the institutional group assembly use is proposed to be located. Mr. Blum, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This item, as you mentioned, is located at 717 and 721 North Academy Street, which is on the west side of North Academy Street. If we pull up the overhead. Here's the subject property here. This is a building that dates back quite some time. It was previously used earlier in the last century as the Ransom School. Some of you might have read an article in the Daily News Journal where this property was recently acquired by the Rutherford County Historical Society. It was previously owned by the late Mr. C.B. Arnett, and the Rutherford County Historical Society now owns the subject property, which includes 2 lots, 717 North Academy, which is the lot with the old Ransom School, and 721 North Academy, which is the vacant lot just to the north.
I think that's where Ken went to high school, isn't it?
I think you and I went to the same high school.
Oh, that's right. Take that back.
The Rutherford County Historical Society is classified in our zoning ordinance as a club. And a club is a type of institutional group assembly use. Institutional group assembly use includes lodge, club, country club, church, school, other places of worship. And institutional group assembly uses are allowed by special use permit in the RD zoning district. The property is zoned RD. In addition, the applicants would like to partner with a nonprofit, which we would classify as a philanthropic institution. And philanthropic institutions are also allowed by special use permit in the RD zoning district. Now, you'll notice that, and I'll start with the variance first, you'll notice that the lot size does not meet the minimum requirements when the 2 lots are combined. They are 0.48 acres, and in order for an institutional group assembly use to be located on a residential lot, it has to meet the requirement of being 3 times the lot size. So in the RD zoning district, it would have to be 0.55 acres. And the applicant has requested a variance to that requirement as these 2 lots, after they are combined, equal 0.48 acres. And he makes the point in his write-up that, as you can see, the parking and all of the proposed use are able to be contained within the subject property, and despite the fact that it is smaller in size than what would normally be required for an institutional group assembly use. And if we could bring up the aerial photo, you'll notice that the majority of the property in the immediate vicinity, or all of it, is zoned residential, but the majority of the uses in the immediate vicinity are also of a residential nature, some single family, some multifamily. There is, however, an existing church to the rear of the subject property, which fronts on North Spring Street. What I put up on the overhead now is the proposed site plan. The applicant is showing the entrance being to the north of the existing structure and coming in with parking on the north side and parking to the rear of the building. It does comply with the requirement that no parking shall be located in the required front setback. You can see the parking does not begin until after the front setback begins. And in addition, the Manny Avenue Comprehensive Plan recommends that parking be located to the side and to the rear of structures. So there's no parking proposed to be located in front of the structure, nor in the required front yard. The use of the subject property, as I mentioned, the use of the property as a club would be primarily on the weekends, and that club being the Rutherford County Historical Society. It would be a repository for their publications. It would offer them storage, and it would also offer them the ability to use it for office uses, as well as some small gatherings. During the week, however, as I mentioned, they're requesting also a special use permit for a philanthropic institution. They do not have it nailed down exactly yet, the exact philanthropic institution, but they would like for it to be available during regular business hours, 8 to 5, for example, during the week for a nonprofit philanthropic institution to be able to utilize, since they won't have very much use of the structure during the week. One of the things that you'll notice on the site plan in front of you is that there is no landscaping other than the existing trees that are interior to the property. You'll notice that there is an existing tree in front that is proposed to be saved, but there are some other trees that will have to be torn down as a part of the parking lot construction. The applicant has committed to using the existing trees along the property lines or to preserving those to the extent possible to serve as a buffer to the neighboring properties. In addition, he is proposing to construct a 6-foot-tall privacy fence along the the western lot line and the northern lot line. There is already a privacy fence along the southern lot line, and there are residential uses to the south and to the north of the subject property. One of the main concerns that we had as far as buffering was making sure that headlights did not shine into the neighboring properties, and that privacy fence will address that concern of making sure that those headlights don't shine into the neighboring properties. The applicant has indicated, and you'll notice on the plan that the landscaping layer there's very little landscaping shown on the plan. The applicant would like to deviate a little bit from the normal, the standard landscaping. He would like to have a landscape architect design a plan that is that resembles what would have been there in the 19th century when the structure was built. And so that one of the conditions that we're recommending, and you'll notice I handed out a revised list of recommended conditions, is that the final landscape plan will be subject to the review and approval of the city horticulturist. It should demonstrate that existing vegetation along the property lines will be preserved where possible, per the commitment made by the applicant in his application materials to use the existing vegetation as landscape screening. Also, you have the latest photometric lighting plan in front of you. The photometric lighting plan it complies with the requirement in the zoning ordinance that the foot candle level be not exceed half a foot candle beyond the property line, with the exception of the north or around the north east corner of the property where it does exceed that amount. I spoke with the engineering firm that designed the photometric lighting plan, and they feel certain that they can revise the plan to comply with that foot candle requirement. That foot candle requirement is not one of the conditions or the standards that are in the zoning ordinance for special use permits. That's in Section 18 of the zoning ordinance, and that can be dealt with at the site plan review stage. And so I've added condition number 4. The final photometric lighting plan must demonstrate compliance with the requirement of Section 18 of the zoning ordinance that illumination generated by the on-site lighting shall not exceed 1/2 foot candle beyond the property line. One of the other things that I wanted to point out was, if we could bring the site plan back up again, please. The applicant has shown this area here as an area for the city trash receptacles to be located. It's not fully enclosed, but for the purposes of the special use permit, it does appear to be screened on all 4 sides. You see there's a very deep area in between the front wing and the rear wing, and the applicant would like to store the trash containers in there. And based on the fact that there's a privacy fence along the southern lot line, it appears that it will be completely hidden from view of adjacent residential properties. I'd like to show you some photographs of the existing site. This is the front of the old Ransom School at 717 North Academy. This is looking at the vacant lot from North Academy, that's to the north. This is a view of the north side of the structure from that vacant lot. And once again, the north side of the structure. This log addition was done by Mr. Arnett several years ago, but it's never been occupied. After it was used as the school, it had been used as a residence for a number of years. But I believe since Mr. Arnett purchased it, no one has actually lived in the structure. Is that correct, Dr. Talbert? This is the back of the structure that Mr. Arnett added on several years ago. This is a little alcove in between the wings where they intend to keep the city trash carts. This is looking along the rear property line to the west. This is that existing privacy fence along the southern lot line. This is a house or a structure that faces on North Spring Street to the rear of the subject property. This is the church that I alluded to earlier that also faces on North Spring to the rear of the subject property. And this is the house that's just to the north of the vacant lot that's a part of the subject property. Directly across the street is a quadruplex. Now, I've read conditions 3 and 4, which I added on, and which is why I included the revised conditions of approval. I'd also just like to read numbers 1 and 2. Number 1, the Planning Commission must grant site plan approval for the proposed development, or the site plan may be reviewed and approved administratively at the discretion of the planning director. This appears to be one that will be that will qualify for administrative approval or administrative review. A re-subdivision plat must be submitted for review, combining the two lots into one, and the plat must be recorded prior to the issuance of the building permit. And in order for the variance, if granted, to be valid, the lots would need to be combined into one to make the subject property 0.48 acres, as opposed to two individual smaller lots. And with that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Dr. E.C. Tolbert is here if you have any questions for him, representing the Rutherford County Historical Society, as is Mr. Ernie Johns.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? All right. Thank you. Dr. Tolbert, Mr. Johns, anything you all would like to add to your application?
First of all, I'm E.C. Tolbert. Live at 7279 Vaughan Road in Murfreesboro. I'd like to thank Matthew Blomley for his support and help with this arduous task. And it's been fun and exciting to have this property being given to us of the Rutherford County Historical Society. I think it has great promise for the community. Of course, it's a rather depraved area, and I think this will certainly be complementary to the area with what we ultimately come up with. We feel in some ways that this property has some origin in the Oakland's plantation. Possibly the house being an overseer's house for the Oakland's plantation. This will just require added research to determine whether or not that's true, but certainly it's of the period of 1840 or thereabouts, and thus we are so pleased to be saving it. And we hope that in some ways we can pursue it for the betterment of Rutherford County and Murfreesboro. We appreciate you considering these variances, and hopefully we can comply with the staff's suggestions further. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer those.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert. Any questions for Dr. Tolbert? Thank you, sir. This time we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or a motion. Let's see, we got we have two components to this application. So we'll consider first the special use permit request in order to operate an institutional group assembly use and a philanthropic institution in this zone.
Chairman Rogers, I make a motion that we approve the special use permit subject to staff comments.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, we'll now consider the request for the variance to the requirement that in residential districts an institutional group assembly use shall have a lot size of not less than 3 times the minimum lot size permitted.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the variance request with the comments from the staff.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Dr. Tolbert, Mr. Johns, that application has been approved in its entirety. And I think probably speak for the rest of the board members that we sincerely appreciate what you and Mr. Tucker and all the members of the Rutherford County Historical Society do for the preservation and the telling of the history of Rutherford County. So I don't want you to think if it goes unnoticed. It very much appreciated. Thank you both. Look forward to having a new structure which we can house some of this information. Thank you. All right. At this time, I actually have got another meeting I've got to go to at the courthouse, so I'm going to turn the meeting over to our Vice Chairman, Mr. Davis Young.
Slide into position of power here.
Ascend to the throne.
Okay, our next item on the agenda is a special use permit amendment, height variance request, application Z11055 by Mr. Kit Osborne of Design Constructors, Inc. for New Vision Baptist Church, requesting an amendment to a special use permit originally approved on March 30th, 2011, allowing the expansion of an existing institutional group assembly use, a church located at 1750 North Thompson Lane. The subject property is located in a residential single-family zone and also in the Battlefield Protection District. The applicant wishes to amend the special use permit in order to modify several aspects of the proposed expansion, including but not limited to building size, building layout, and parking lot layout. Regarding the same property, the applicant is also requesting a 7-foot variance of the 35-foot maximum permitted building height in the RS-15 and Battlefield Protection Zones in order to allow a 42-foot tall structure, a building addition to the existing church.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Young. The subject property, as you mentioned, is 1750 North Thompson Lane, New Vision Baptist Church. And we look on the overhead at the aerial photo. Here's the existing church here, and of course Thompson Lane, and the existing parking lot. This has been before the board a number of times before. Initially, it was approved in the early to mid '90s before it was annexed into the city limits. But since it's been in the city limits, as it's zoned RS-15, it has had to come to the board several times before each proposed expansion. And you'll recollect in March of this year, Mr. Osborne and the church came before the board for an expansion. Shortly thereafter, they decided to modify their proposed plans and come up with a different layout to the building itself, and which then changed some of the parking. So they're requesting an amendment to that special use permit that was approved in March of this year for the layout that's before you today, as opposed to the layout that is before you, or that was before you back in March. Now there are some aspects of that approval in March that will still stand. If you recall, there were 3 variances that went along with that request. 2 for parking in the required front yard and 1 landscape variance. And I'll point those out to you in just a moment on the site plan. Those are still good. That's not changing. Those areas of the site are remaining the same. The area that is changing is the area of the building addition, which would be directly to the north and west of the existing church building. Now what I'll do is I'll show both plans to you so you can see the difference between the two. This is the March plan. You'll see that they were expanding the building a little bit more north of the building, as opposed to the plan that I'll show you in a moment, which comes out a little bit further to the west towards Thompson Lane. This was a larger addition too. The one that was approved in March was 51,066 square feet, whereas the proposed addition is 41,200 square feet. So they're actually looking to decrease the size by about 10,000 square feet. Now you'll see the variances here, here, and here are remaining the same. As I mentioned, those areas of the site are not changing. Now here's the current plan that you have before you. Here is the sanctuary addition, which, as you can see, juts out a little bit further to the west towards Thompson Lane. And there's a new classroom wing addition that is directly to the north of the existing classroom wing that's on site right now. And it's forced them to rearrange the parking lot because before the building was going to come out like so, and now it's coming out more this way and this way. So they've had to rework their parking lot. And they've worked with Mr. Balachandra, the city's traffic engineer, on the reworking of the parking lot, and he is satisfied with the plans as they've been submitted. Now, as I mentioned, they are proposing a 41,200 square foot expansion, which would include a 25,900 square foot worship space with a 4,200 square foot lobby, as well as an 11,100 square foot classroom wing. The new worship space will seat approximately 1,500 people, which is an increase over the existing sanctuary's 940 seat capacity. And the applicant has indicated that except for holiday services and larger scale gatherings, the existing sanctuary will not be used concurrently with the new one. The new sanctuary, after it's built, will be the primary sanctuary. The exterior materials used for the worship space addition will be brick and ephes, and the red brick will be accented with ephes. The elevations submitted depict the exterior facade of the classroom addition to consist entirely of brick. This bottom area is from the perspective of looking at the front of the existing facility, which is here, kind of grayed out, to the new facility, which will have more of a flat roof. And here is the ornamental tower. As you know, ornamental towers for churches and residential zoning districts can go up to 70 feet tall. This one is proposed to be at 47 feet tall and does not need a variance because that is below the acceptable height for ornamental towers for churches. Here's kind of a 3D view of the proposed addition. This is kind of looking at right at the end corner, which will face Thompson Lane of the sanctuary addition. Some photographs of the existing site. You can see the existing sanctuary building. Apparently the sun was not very conducive to taking photographs on that day. Another photograph of the existing sanctuary. The addition will be over in this area here. In addition to the special use permit amendment, the applicant is also requesting a height variance. Back in March, he was approved for a 7-foot height variance for the proposed building addition. And now this is not for the ornamental tower. This is to the top of the parapet wall on the rest of the sanctuary addition. It would be 42 feet to the top of the parapet wall. And on flat roofs, we measure to the highest point. And so the top of the parapet wall will be 42 feet, which is 7 feet above the maximum permitted 35-foot building height, which is in both the RS-15 and Battlefield Protection Overlay districts. The applicant was requesting 7 feet, like he was approved for back in March. The reason why we are taking the height variance back is because the building itself, the building orientation is changing. More of the building is actually located in the Battlefield Protection District now that it juts out further to Thompson Lane than the addition that was approved back in March. So we felt it was appropriate to take the height variance back to the Board of Zoning Appeals for reconsideration since the building is different, is at a different location. So with that being said, if the board approves the special use permit request, staff recommends the following condition. The first two conditions are identical to the conditions of approval placed on the original special use permit in March. The Planning Commission must grant site plan approval for the proposed development. As a function of its site plan review, the Planning Commission will also have final architectural review of the building, and all building orientation requirements must be met to the satisfaction of the Planning Commission. Number two, the landscape plan will be subject to the final review and approval of the city horticulturist. To the extent possible, appropriate measures must be shown in the plan and executed in the field during construction to preserve and not damage the existing tree line located adjacent to the eastern property line. And number three, any signage associated with the proposed development will be subject to separate review and approval by the city's sign administrator. And the reason I included that is because there are a number of building features that we want to make sure are compliant with the city's sign ordinance. And of course, the signage is not subject to review as a part of the special use permit amendment, but will be reviewed separately for compliance with our sign ordinance, and we just want to put that on the record. Mr. Osborne is in attendance at the meeting to answer any questions the board may have, and each of the two requests will need to be taken in separate motions. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have as well.
Thank you, Matthew. Any questions for Matthew at this point? Hearing none, will anything the applicant would like to add? None, and at this point we'll conduct the public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against? It's pretty empty. We'll close the public hearing and open the floor for discussions or a motion. And as Matthew said, we have two components to deal with here.
Mr. Young, I'll make a motion that we approve the amended special use permit, subject to all staff comments.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? There are none. That application has been approved. Now for the height variance.
Mr. Young, I move for approval of the 7-foot height variance, subject to staff comments.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? There are none. That has been approved as well. That gets you guys squared away. Let's see. Our next item is staff reports and other business. Looks like we have something coming up.
What I'll do is I'll hand off to Mr. Ives, and I think I'm going to pass some handouts to you. And this is with regards to the new weeds and grass ordinance that we discussed at our July meeting. And we anticipate having our first request come before the board next month. So we wanted to make sure that y'all were prepared, as this will be a new type of item that you've never seen before here at the board. And with that, I'll pass handouts out and let Mr. Ives take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. Given the time, I'm tempted to take the Ken Honeycutt approach and say, are there any questions? But that's not a very good idea on this one. I think y'all might need a little bit more of this. We did mention this briefly in July, I think it was, that we have amended our weeds and grass ordinance. The basic rule in the city has always been that depending on the size of your lot, you have to mow it or chemically treat it a certain number of times every year, and you can't let weeds and grass grow tall. Well, as water quality protection has become an issue in this city as well as across the country, there are certain areas in town that are now required to be left unmowed. And we have, for water quality and also for the management of the runoff, we are encouraging, in appropriate cases, people to create rain gardens. And rain gardens are an area that is somewhat like a pond, but it's not designed to be wet all the time. And they're planted with certain types of native grasses and species that tolerate staying wet a lot. And also, though, there are areas that you don't want to mow. You want to leave them natural. So we will automatically have, under the amended ordinance, we'll automatically have areas such as a water quality protection zone that may be approved by site plan or in a planned development where there's a buffer zone created. That will automatically be exempted from the mowing requirement. Also, and a good example is in front of our new hospital, there are two detention areas there that are planted with, that are really water gardens that are planted with native species that are not designed to be mowed. If a water garden is created by a site plan or in a planned development, then that will be exempt from the mowing requirement. We also created a provision for people to come in and ask for an exemption from the mowing requirement. And we've structured this so that these exemptions, if there are no, we'll post them just like we would a normal variance or zoning amendment. We'll post the property that says there's a zoning application applied for. We'll send notices to the people within 250 feet of the area. If no one objects to it, then it'll be considered by staff, and staff will evaluate it as to whether they think it makes sense, whether it is going to be a water quality feature, whether it'll add value, whether we feel it'll be a habitat for mosquitoes and a bad health risk and therefore shouldn't be granted. But if someone does object to the granting of the exemption, then that request and the objection will come to this board for a public hearing and then a decision. The basic premise of not mowing is that you're going to leave the area in a natural state or as a wilderness area or as a water quality area. So a typical example might be a particular area next to a stream bank. Generally speaking, the thicker the vegetation, the more small trees and things that are growing near the stream, not necessarily right next to it, and next to it's good too, but even back, I think our water quality ordinance is a 50-foot buffer zone. The more vegetation there is there, it accomplishes two basic things. Number one, it holds the soil so you don't have erosion, because the roots and the grasses and bushes, the roots will hold the soil. And number two, it also acts as a filter. It's a natural filter so that the pollution that we generate on a daily basis by driving cars and the other things of that nature that get washed off of parking lots, washed off of roads, that there will be a natural filter to keep more of that or allow less of that to get into the waterways and end up in Percy Priest Lake and in the Gulf of Mexico where so much of it goes now. An applicant has to, when they apply, they'll apply like they would for a variance, but it's for an exemption from the mowing ordinance. They'll have to give us a map showing what area they want to, and they can apply for an entire lot. For if somebody has a 3-acre vacant lot, they could apply to have the whole lot covered by the exemption, or they could apply for, pick a number, the 50 or 100 feet of it that's closest to a stream bank, or maybe they would apply for an exemption for the middle of the lot and want to mow the edges. There's a variety of things that they could do. They will need to give us a map that shows what they want to do and that shows any residential properties that are within, particularly show what they want to exempt that's within 50 feet of any residential property. And as I said, we'll post it and notify property owners. If a BZA hearing is going to happen, we will look at having a tour for those special ones. The mechanics of that have not been worked out. We're not sure, depending on where it is, whether there's even going to be access to get to it or not. But we may try to do tours of those areas so that you have some better idea of what it is you're being asked to rule on. We will handle it a whole lot like we have our other agenda items. Staff will introduce the item and give you at least the background and the general background and what's being requested. We would expect the applicants to kind of make their case. We don't really anticipate that as part of the introduction that staff would say we think this should be done or we think it shouldn't be done. But that we would introduce it and then let the applicant come forward and sort of present their case as to why the exemption should be granted. We will, on occasion, and we may not every time, but on occasion we could have representatives of planning or engineering, building codes, urban environmental, fire department, possibly legal department. I'm not quite sure where we would have an opinion particularly on it. But others in the city staff, and I would think that in the environmental engineering group especially, may have some comments on whether or not this really would be a good water quality protection area, if that's what the applicant is presenting it as. And possibly some negatives. The fire department may say if this is allowed to grow up here, it's a fire hazard. And those would be things that then you would consider that. And, of course, it'll be open to the public and not limited just to the people within 250 feet, although they'll be the ones that get the notice. But like any of our public hearings, anyone in the public can speak for or against the proposed exemption. In my memo here, there's a list of the kinds of things that would be looked at. and it'll vary tremendously based on where the property is and the other features that are surrounding it and on the property, close to wetlands, whether there are designated water quality protection areas either on the property or close to the property, if there's streams, springs, wetlands, waters of the state like Stones River or any of the designated creeks, heavily wooded areas, for example. If there's sinkholes that have to be worked around and managed, if it's in a floodplain, it may be a different matter than if it's not in a floodplain. The terrain, if it's steep, if there's a steep slope, how easy is it to get access to this, to take care of it? The maintenance history could be a factor. What the property use is, and the uses both of this property and surrounding it, and any man-made or natural features that are on the property. The BZA can either they can grant the request in whole or in part, or can deny it. And in an appropriate, if the BZA feels they need more information, I believe you would have the right to defer action for a month and ask either staff or the applicant or an opponent to present you with more information, more detail about the basis for their position. Ultimately, it seems to us that this is going to be a reasonableness test, which is a little bit different, I think, from your normal actions on people meet the requirements for a special use permit. They're generally entitled to it unless there's some reason not to, some compelling reason not to. The variances, we have a list here of the matters to be considered. We may yet develop something of that nature. At this point, we don't, and as we've analyzed this and talked about it, we kind of come up with sort of three overriding things along with all the other things that might be mentioned. The burden on the applicant to comply with the current ordinance, and at the same time the benefit to the applicant of being exempted from it. And have to consider the potential negative impact to adjoining or surrounding property owners. And these are subjective. Many of these are going to be subjective tests. And at the same time, they either positive or negative impact on the larger community. So it's conceivable that there might be one property owner who has some negative impact, and yet this particular feature our engineering staff feels will be a great benefit to cleaning up the East Fork of the Stones River, and perhaps the benefit to the larger community would override that, and perhaps not. I mean, I'm using kind of an extreme example there. And as I've said here in the memo, I think ultimately each of you will have to decide whether the applicant's position or the opponent's position, which one is really more reasonable, and then all of the factors of the credibility of the witnesses, the credibility of the opinions, will all play into that. And I do also want to mention the ordinance provides that city staff in the future can revoke an exemption after notice if there's a finding that there's a fire or some other kind of hazard to public health, safety, and welfare. So again, even after one is granted, it can be revoked if it becomes a problem for the community. Sam Huddleston is here, as is Say Chase and our engineering department. Robert Holtz is also here from Codes Enforcement. Codes, of course, is the Building Codes Department primarily enforces the weeds and grass ordinance. Complaints generally it's on a complaint basis. At this time, sometimes our inspectors will see something as they're driving around and will act on it, but the most of the weeds and grass complaints are when a neighbor complains that the property hasn't been mowed for months and it's overrun with debris and whatever, and then we investigate. So they'll be involved in this, and certainly the engineering group will be involved in analyzing the requests that come in. Did any of you have anything to add to what I've got? Questions?
The objection, is there what rises to the level of an objection? Is it an email? Is there a form they're going to have to come fill out, like the applicant did, to state a specific objection? Is there, how do they get in front of us, I guess, is that delineated?
Well, that'll really be a staff decision. It very broadly, of the people we notify, it says if any such landowner shall object to this, well, it does say call it forward in writing. So a phone call might not trigger it, but on the other hand, if we had 3 or 4 phone calls from people, it might be that staff would say, we need to go ahead and send this one to the BZA, even if we did not get something in writing. So I think it'd ultimately be a staff determination of what has come in about it.
And then would notice go out to those folks that there's going to be a hearing at that point, or just to the objecting party, or just be in publication?
I think that at this point we would just publish as our normal. Do we give specific notice of these public hearings to people?
Yeah, I believe what Mr. Ives, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think probably what we would do would we would take the list that has been generated by the Building and Codes Department, and when the Building and Codes Department initially notifies the landowners within 250 feet of the pending exemption request, and then they have 30 days to get their objection in writing. If they get that objection in writing to the Board of Zoning Appeal or to the Building and Code staff, then the applicant at that point can either say, well, I'd like to pursue this to the Board of Zoning Appeals, or I'm going to go ahead and cut the grass. If he decides to pursue it to the Board of Zoning Appeals, then the application moves over to the planning and engineering side of the hall, at which case we would process it like all the other items, and we would send another notice to those same landowners saying that now there's just not a request been made, but now there is officially a hearing scheduled.
Okay.
That was the impression that I was under, so that they would be notified in writing of the exemption initially by the Building and Codes Department, and then of the public hearing by the Planning Department.
The application to the Building and Codes Department.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and then of course we would include to satisfy the legal notice requirements, we would include that item in with all the other items when we do our legal notice in the Murfreesboro Post.
Once created, is it you just don't have to mow it if you don't want to, or is it you can't mow it?
It could depend on what's applied for, but one that I understand is going to be coming in is and I don't want to describe it too much, but it would be an area that is most likely going to develop someday in this market and in this time. The likelihood is it's going to be a while. And what other factors there may be, I don't know, but I think we would expect that someday, whether it's 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now, there'll either be an office building or an apartment building or some single-family houses on this piece of property. Other pieces of property may be, and so, that would be that he's exempt. She is exempt from mowing that until they're ready to do something with it, at which time, of course, they would. But it's still, at this point, they're structured as exemptions from the requirement, which would mean that if somebody decides they want to go mow some or all of it, they would be able to.
No, I don't. We're not creating any sort of protection. we talk about it like a zone, but I guess I just wanted to make sure we're really just exempting their requirement to mow it. We're not creating any sort of preservation area that would keep them from developing it or mowing it or paving it or whatever they want to do.
Not by this process.
Right.
There may be a way to create a new water quality protection zone on a piece of property, but that's not what's contemplated here.
Okay. And you said that staff would have the right to revoke it once granted. Do they have would that be a staff decision that they could then appeal back to the BZA, the revocation, or is that the final word on that, or what's their...
That would seem to be a staff decision that could be appealed, but I'm not certain of that.
But it wouldn't automatically be set for a hearing if staff revoked it?
No.
It'd be up to
staff
the
would give
person
notice that it's being revoked as of a certain date, and that they're required then to do whatever they're required to do.
I'm through.
Good crossfire there. Any other questions?
But most of the situations will be handled through the staff, is that right?
I'm sorry?
I believe you said most of the situations would be handled through the staff without getting us involved?
Not necessarily most. It will come into staff first. If no one objects, then staff will handle it. But if there's an objection returned to the city in writing within the 30-day period, then it's, unless the applicant would decide to withdraw, which of course they might, but if not, then it would come to BZA. So I don't have any real sense of whether we'll have objections on all of them, whether we'll have objections on very few. I don't have any sense at all of that. I know the one that we do have now, there was an objection, and so the plan is to have it on our October meeting agenda.
I think one thing to remember is that the majority of the weeds and grass issues around the city are handled by the building and code staff, Mr. Holtz and his staff. So it's only if someone decides to appeal or decides to request an exemption, say they've been notified by the building and code staff that they have to mow the grass, they have to keep it at a certain height, and they say, well, what are my options? Do I have the options to make an exemption request? Well, then they'll go to Mr. Holtz's staff, file the necessary paperwork, and then if there is objection by those surrounding landowners, then it goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So, but the ones that are requested for exemption are, the majority of the weeds and grass cases are, will never make it through the exemption process. Mr. Holtz and his code staff handle those as they have for years. The only time that this would come to you is if someone requests an exemption and then there's an objection to that exemption from the neighboring landowner.
In an extreme case, if somebody didn't want to mow their yard and use this as an exception, at the staff level you're going to mow it. I mean, is that even a scenario that could happen that somebody wanted to use this? What?
I would hesitate to say at this point that couldn't happen. I know that we have a number of mowing issues on individual lots or even houses that are in foreclosure. And the people have moved out. The bank doesn't get anybody in to mow it for quite a while, and we struggle with that a lot. I would think it unlikely that there would be much favor of granting someone in a single-family subdivision an exemption from mowing his yard when his or her yard. On the other hand, I could see that in a fairly a larger estate lot, that a portion of the rear of it that maybe is along the river, someone would want to, or one of the creeks, that someone would want to create a an exemption, for a part of it that's on the river. And I wouldn't say that it's impossible that someone might design their whole lot to be a rain garden. That doesn't really sound very likely, but I wouldn't want to say they couldn't do it.
Okay. Sounds good. Any other questions? Guess we'll learn more about it when we see one, see a live example. It'll probably help my understanding. I want to see one in motion. So.
Right.
All right. Any other staff reports?
No, sir.
All right. If not, we're adjourned.